What if you found out that science has discovered evidence that life was designed by a superintelligence and that the fingerprints of that creator are all over the DNA of life? Hi, I'm Kirk, and I'm a scientist and a philosopher and a person who spends a lot of time thinking about the why questions in life. So if you're interested in discussions pertaining to God, science, and life, then please subscribe to my channel here, where I'll be posting on a regular basis. You can also subscribe to my social media accounts, and the links are below. If I were to give you a piece of paper with several lines of alphabet characters and numbers on it, and I asked you if it was inscribed by an intelligent source, how would you know? What would you look for? In 2005, a fascinating paper by Abel and Travers was published in the science journal Theoretical Biology and Medical Modeling. It described 3 types of complexity that we observe in sequences of letters or digits or numbers. One type is random, which refers to things that are disordered or in disarray, like a string of letters that are gibberish. The second type is ordered. For example, where a single letter is simply repeated over and over again. Both types occur in nature all the time and are very easy to produce through natural processes. The third type of complexity, however, was unusually interesting. It was a sequence of letters or symbols that had some sort of usefulness or function. The authors called it functional complexity. But the amazing thing is that we have found 3 examples of it. First, human languages. Second, computer languages. And third, the genetic information encoded in the DNA of plants and animals. Now, this is where it gets especially interesting. In the paper, Abel and Travers showed that something they call volitional agency is required to produce functional sequence complexity like I just described. By volitional agency, they meant a mind that has the capability of making informed choices in creating a sequence that will carry some sort of meaningful or useful information so they can accomplish an objective. We know that this is the case for human languages and computer languages, but the implications for the genetic information encoded in DNA are enormous. To put a finer point on this, what they showed is that the genetic information encoded in our DNA had to have been programmed by an intelligent mind capable of making extremely well-informed decisions. It so happened that just 2 years earlier, a short 1-page article had appeared in the science journal Nature, suggesting that we needed a term to apply to the genetic information encoded in DNA and proteins, and the author of that article suggested the term functional information, referring to information that is useful or provides a function. It could be useful to a biological cell or meaningful to a human mind. This is exactly what Abel and Travers were writing about when they talked about functional complexity. So where am I going with this? The implications for the functional information we find encoded in DNA are enormous. According to Abel and Travers, it would have had to been programmed by a volitional agent. In other words, we have the fingerprints of an intelligent programmer all over the DNA of life. Of course, that raises a question. Could evolution produce significant levels of functional information? A recent article in the science magazine New Scientist highlights this objection. It was titled, "How a Creationist Instinct Stops Us from Seeing Evolution Everywhere." In the article, the author Graham Lawton points out that when we see the intricate perfection of an eye or wing, our instincts tell us that it was designed by an intelligent creator. This is what he means by the term creationist instinct. He thinks our instincts are wrong, however, and writes the following. "Then along came Darwin and proved the obvious wrong. The appearance of design is an illusion. Biological order arises by slow, undirected trial and error coupled with natural selection, aka evolution." Really? We need to think critically about what Lawton wrote. Did Darwin actually prove this? Did anyone since Darwin prove this? When we ask these kind of questions, we find that we have abundant verification that Darwinian processes such as natural selection work when it comes to variation that naturally occurs within a species or genus, but it has utterly failed when its single most important prediction has been tested. In the video just before this one, I discussed this in more detail, but in science, we test a theory by testing its most essential or key predictions. The most essential prediction of Darwinism is that there must be no limits to the variation we see in nature if we are going to obtain the full diversity of life that we see today. But every experiment we have done since Darwin where we test this prediction falsifies it every time, no exceptions. We hit a wall beyond which further change is lethal or simply not possible. One example is the dog. Darwinian evolution in the wild is a blind, mindless, unguided process, so it could take millions of years to get the kind of variation that we see in dog breeding today. But by selective breeding, we can accelerate the evolutionary process by orders of magnitude such that we have an enormous variety of dog breeds today. But despite the enormous amount of effort put into dog breeding, there are limits beyond which it is simply not possible to continue in that direction. Another example is the selective breeding program that has gone on into agriculture. Although we have been able to obtain a wide variety of wheat, we again hit a wall beyond which further biological change is simply not possible. The bottom line is this: modern science shows repeatedly that there are limits to biological change. Our only alternative is genetic engineering by intelligent scientists. The bottom line is this: modern science shows repeatedly that there are limits to biological change. Evolution of completely novel life forms is simply not possible under natural conditions. Our only alternative is genetic engineering by intelligent scientists. But it gets worse. Modern science has revealed that the functional information encoded in DNA contains the digital instructions to build that organism. Craig Venter, first scientist to decode the human genome, states that it is time that we recognized genetic information as computer code. It is a digital language that contains functional information. So we need to ask the question, is it really true, as Lawton asserts, that the functional information encoded in DNA can be achieved by slow, undirected trial and error coupled with natural selection? Science says that it is not. In fact, a paper by evolutionary biologist Eugene Koonin argues that even simple RNA replication is so unlikely that we should not expect it to occur anywhere in the universe. So rather than granting the obvious, which is an intelligent mind doing the programming, he postulates an infinite number of universes in order to overcome the odds. One of the projects in my own PhD research in bioinformatics was to develop a method to estimate the amount of functional information required to code for just a protein family. It turns out that the average protein requires a level of information such that if we tried to accumulate it in the way Lawton suggests, we would not expect to find a single stable folding functional protein anywhere in the universe. But it gets even worse still. Darwinian theory predicts that functional information for biological life began at essentially zero and has slowly increased by the blind, mindless process Lawton imagines to digitally encode the full range of life as we see it today. In reality, research shows that natural processes are slowly destroying the DNA of living things. To clarify, the number of destructive mutations in each generation of plants or animals or bacteria exceeds the number of constructive mutations by a substantial margin. To illustrate the problem, and I mentioned this in my last video, but let's just briefly revisit it. Imagine you sent out a tweet and each time someone retweets it, some of the letters are randomly changed and only about 1% of those random changes make any sense. As it is retweeted, it gradually loses its meaning and is replaced with an increasing amount of gibberish until it becomes completely nonsensical. This is exactly what is happening with mutations in the genetic information in the DNA of life. The rate of loss of genetic information is significantly greater than the rate of correction. You do not need to be a rocket scientist to figure that if this keeps going, then you will be heading towards an inevitable wreck of biological life. And this unfortunate discovery has been observed and published in science journals for bacteria, the famous fruit fly, and even humanity. So the title of Lawton's article, How a Creationist Instinct Stops Us Seeing Evolution Everywhere, maybe should more accurately read, How an Unfulfilled Darwinian Belief Stops Us Seeing Design Everywhere for what it actually is. Design. A promissory note is something you can give another person when you owe them money and promise to pay them at some future date. What Darwinism gave us was a promissory note that led us to believe we could prove that the design Lawton admits is all around us is not actually designed but done by evolution. Unfortunately, modern science shows that not only has this promissory note not been paid, but it will never be paid. Natural mutations are destroying life, not creating it. So, what options does science have for explaining the functional information encoded in DNA? Keep in mind that a scientific explanation must be testable and repeatable, and it is not to be confused with promissory notes or creative science fiction stories. So creative Darwinian stories must remain classified as science fiction, not tested, verified, and repeatable. Right now, science has only one verifiable, testable, and repeatable option on the table. It's intelligence. Every time you send a text or an email or write an essay, you are creating functional or meaningful information. Intelligence is the only thing science has ever observed that creates statistically significant levels of functional information. Intelligence is the only thing we know of that can create enormous amounts of functional information in a testable, observable, repeatable, and verifiable way. Science has no other option on the table. I think we can summarize all this in just 3 statements. Number 1, a significant level of functional information requires intelligence to produce. Number 2, the DNA of all plants, animals, and bacteria contains an enormous level of functional information. Number 3, therefore, the fingerprints of an intelligent programmer or designer are all over the genomes of life. Now, I've said a number of things here that you may wish to dive deeper into, including references for some of the points that I've made. Please check out my blog where I have a series of articles looking at these things in more detail. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video, or at least found it thought-provoking. And if you did, please share it, or you can leave a comment in the section below. And also, don't forget to hit the like button.